Hello and welcome to the Memory Card. Here on Zelda Month, I'm going to be continuing this celebration of the Legend of Zelda franchise by talking about one of the most important games ever made, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time for the Nintendo 64. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time was released in 1998 for the Nintendo 64, in what has gone down as one of the best years in video games. That year saw the release of many classics that defined the entire industry, from Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation 1, to Half-Life 1 on the PC, to Pokemon Red and Blue versions on the Game Boy, among many others. And since its release in 1998, Ocarina of Time is often considered one of the best games ever made, and it's easy to see why. Ocarina of Time has an importance to it that very few games could ever claim to have. The story isn't all that complicated, and it has a lot of similarities to most Zelda games since A Link to the Past, and that makes sense considering that almost every 3D Zelda game since its release has used Ocarina of Time as its basic template. And it makes going back to play Ocarina of Time very easy for a newer Zelda fan, which is a good thing. Despite its now dated polygonal graphics and low-res textures and blurry visuals in general that are so indicative of Nintendo 64 games, especially if you try and play it on an HD TV, despite that, Ocarina of Time has a timeless quality to it that transcends the limitations of its hardware, and part of what makes this game age so well in so many ways is how well its story and its world is realized. It has a typical hero's tale of starting from humble beginnings to realizing one's destiny to ultimately save the day. Link goes from being an unremarkable, fairyless kid living in the forest with other ageless kids, to getting his own fairy and traveling the kingdom of Hyrule, which was so vast in comparison to the games that came before it. Now, other Zelda games had big worlds before Ocarina of Time, and other games did 3D before it, but there had never been such a fully realized 3D world until you saw Link run across Hyrule Field for the first time. And that sense of adventure that swept over kids playing this back in '98 is still as potent in Ocarina of Time, and it's not hard to put myself in that mindset, even though I personally didn't get to play this game back then. And I also think that's a testament to the quality of this game, because you don't need the rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia to see how great this game was and still is. Ocarina of Time not only has the great dungeon design and world design that you would expect from a standout Zelda game, but it also has some of the best music in the franchise. The themes to Hyrule Field, Kokiri Village, and the Gerudo Desert and Kakariko Village alone are enough to make this one of the best soundtracks ever put in a video game. But the music is not only memorable, but it does an amazing job adding to the tone and supplementing the story and world of this game. The beginning of Ocarina of Time is whimsical and fun, and exudes a childlike sense of adventure to it, but then when Link returns to Hyrule 7 years later, the situation is much more dire, and the legend truly takes an epic scale. The way the game is able to illustrate the changes in 7 years to the different locations and characters throughout Link's journey in Hyrule is truly a remarkable feat, especially for '98. Although the situation never feels quite as dark or dire as later entries in the series, there is still a great sense of hope that is throughout this game, and Link embodies that. Whether it's small things like helping out a ranch or saving the Gorons from starvation or enslavement, Link truly embodies what a classic hero is, and the choice to keep Link a silent protagonist helps you put yourself in Link's situation even more, in the same way that it did for Gordon Freeman in the Half-Life series. And the dungeons in Ocarina of Time are truly some of the best in the series. The Deku Tree does a fantastic job as a tutorial for how dungeons will work in 3D, which especially makes sense considering that this was the first Zelda game done in 3D, so they would need to show people the ropes, so to speak. And the Dodongo Cavern is a blast to this day. I love going through that one, and the Shadow Temple is really eerie, and the Spirit Temple does a great job of spicing things up by utilizing both young and adult Links to beat that dungeon. And this game also has some of my favorite boss fights in the series, from simple ones like Queen Goma and King Dodongo, to more challenging ones like Volvagia, Shadow Link, and Twin Rova. The only dungeon that I don't look forward to is the Water Temple. It's infamous for being one of the hardest challenges in gaming, but honestly it's more tedious than it is difficult. However, I can see how that temple would have been a nightmare for kids back then, especially if they didn't have a guide or Nintendo Power. It's much easier on the 3DS, and at least there is a boss fight in the end that's really fun. Even though the characters in Ocarina of Time are simpler than later entries in the series, in a way that simplicity helps them be more memorable. I'll never forget characters like Malon at Lon Lon Ranch and her struggles during the 7 years of Link's absence, or this game's version of Ganon. It would also be hard to forget Big Goron or the side quest to get his awesome sword. And I still don't really get how a Goron is able to grow as big as Death Mountain. And, I mean, they eat rocks. Does he just eat other mountains at that point? Anyway, Ocarina of Time might not be a hugely complicated game, but it is memorable beyond words. And its uncanny way of being able to get the player sucked into its world and never be forgotten is part of the magic of this game that has never faded. The controls of Ocarina of Time are ironically part of what dates this game, and also what helps make it so important and influential in 3D game design. Ocarina of Time pioneered the Z-targeting lock-on system, which has since been used in every Zelda game, well, every 3D Zelda game since then, and a lot of 3D action games in general. We wouldn't really have lock-on targeting systems if it wasn't for games like Ocarina of Time. And there are elements of the controls of this game that make it age not quite as well in comparison to other Zelda games. For instance, you only really have control of the camera, and means that if you press the Z button, the camera locks behind you. Otherwise, the game takes control of the camera, which can be a bit harder to deal with if you're more used to modern games where you always have control of the camera. And at times it can be a bit of a pain, but in Ocarina of Time, Nintendo did a great job with the camera, so there weren't really very many times I had issues with the camera. And most of the time, the Z lock-on targeting system works really, really well. There are times where the lock-on goes onto things that you don't want it to lock onto, but that's an issue with basically every lock-on system. And ironically, even though the Nintendo 64 controller is often considered one of the worst controllers Nintendo has made, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask make some of the best usage of that controller because of the usage of the item mapping and playing the ocarina with the C buttons. It makes it to where when you try and play this on the GameCube or a virtual console, it's a bit harder to play because of that right analog stick just doesn't give you that definite control of those 4 C buttons. So realistically, if you want to play Ocarina of Time, you're going to want to play it on the Nintendo 64 or the 3DS, because those two places are where this game controls the best. Regardless of the fact that I did not get to play this game when it first came out, I can still see why it is so deservedly revered by Zelda fans to this day. I actually didn't get to play this game until I was in high school, and up until then I would see it in videos and on TV, and I would hear the reverence people had for Ocarina of Time. And up until I've got my first copy of Ocarina of Time, I always respected the Zelda franchise, but I wasn't necessarily a fan because I only grew up with Zelda 1 and 2, the NES versions, but on the Game Boy Advance, those re-releases, and I was terrible at them, so I was never really able to get into the Zelda franchise. And I figured, why not start with the game that people consider the best in the franchise, Ocarina of Time. I bought my first copy off my friend Joe in high school, and it was actually the copy he played as a kid, and he helped build up that mystique for me for this game, from his stories of whenever he played it back then, and how long it took him to beat it on his own with some help from his brother as well. And that also helped add some more sentimental value to that first copy of this game that I have and still have to this day. Also, some of my most treasured video game memories are of when he and I beat this game over the course of a week on my last winter break in college. I'll never forget being able to spend that time and work through all the dungeons and all that together. Even though by that point I'd beaten the game a few times, and at that point I almost had the game memorized. But it was still a really fun experience that I'll always have with me. Although I adore this game, it did actually take me 3 tries to really get into Ocarina of Time. When I originally played this on the N64 and then eventually downloaded it on the Wii U's Virtual Console because I wanted to play the game again, but my brother had the N64 and I wasn't able to play the game. I hadn't bought my own N64 yet. But when I originally played it on those 2 versions, I would get stuck before the Dongo Cavern because I didn't realize that I had to go back and visit Kokiri Village and learn Saria's song. And while this game has aged very well in a lot of ways, there are definitely a few times where I don't know how kids could have beaten this game back then without at least calling Nintendo Power or buying the player's guide. And there's definitely a couple of times like that where the game feels a little obtuse, but then again, that could just be me at the time coming from a more modern mindset. Maybe for people in 1998 it wouldn't have been quite as difficult. However, eventually, when I did buy the 3DS remake of this game, I finally got past that barrier and got to experience the grandeur of Ocarina of Time, and I've since beaten this game many, many times. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is easily one of the best games of that generation, and I can definitely see why it's considered one of the best games ever made. And though it is high on my list of favorite Zelda games, it isn't my favorite. Like Super Mario 64, it laid a foundation in 3D game design, let alone 3D Zelda games, but it has since been refined and improved. But even though Zelda games have gotten better, Ocarina of Time still has a timeless sense of adventure and charm that transcends resolution, polygons, and textures. It truly does deserve to be remembered as one of the best games ever made. Ocarina of Time is often considered the best Zelda game and one of the best games ever made, and it is truly one of the most important landmark releases in the video game industry, and it deserves all the accolades that it has. It was reviewed fantastically back then, and it's not just nostalgia. People loved this game and still do for good reason. I do. I own 5 physical copies of this, every release on the GameCube and 64, and even the 3DS. But I wouldn't say it is the best Zelda game. If you want to see that, you're going to have to come back next week where I conclude Zelda Month. But regardless, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on the memory card.